The longest battle of World War I prologue. The fortress that would not fall, imagine standing on a hill in northeastern France in the winter of 1916. The ground beneath your feet is frozen solid. The air bites at your face with cruel February wind. In the distance, you can see the fortress city of Verdun, its medieval walls and modern concrete forts standing watch over the Meuse River Valley. This place has guarded France for over 1,000 years. Kings have defended it. Armies have besieged it. But nothing, absolutely nothing in its long history, could prepare it for what was about to happen. Because in just a few hours, this quiet winter landscape will transform into the closest thing to hell on earth that human beings have ever created. For the next 10 months, from February 21st to December 18th, 1916, Verdun will become a name that echoes through history alongside the Somme as the ultimate symbol of the First World War's industrial horror. Over 700,000 men will become casualties in the fighting. 300,000 will die. And when it is finally over, the landscape will be so destroyed that it will take decades for anything to grow there again. This is the story of Verdun, the longest battle of the First World War. A battle where men were fed into a mincing machine of artillery fire. A battle where the earth itself became the enemy, churned into a moonscape of shell craters filled with mud, blood, and the bodies of the dead. A battle where soldiers wrote in their diaries that hell itself could not be more terrible than what they were experiencing. This is the story of how two nations bled themselves, white fighting over a few square miles of devastated ground. And it begins with a man who believed he had discovered the perfect strategy to win the war. Part 1. The German Plan, Operation Gericht. The year 19, and World War has already been raging for over a year. What everyone thought would be a quick, decisive conflict has instead become a nightmarish stalemate. From the beaches of the North Sea to the mountains of Switzerland, two massive armies face each other across a line of trenches that stretches for hundreds of miles. Millions of men like rats in muddy ditches, enduring artillery bombardments, machine gun fire, poison gas, and diseases that kill as surely as any bullet. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff, stared at maps of the Western Front in his headquarters and contemplated the strategic situation. He was a hard, practical man, a Prussian officer of the old school. He had no illusions about glory or quick victories. The war had moved beyond such romantic notions. Now it was about cold calculation, about numbers, about finding or break the enemy's will to continue fighting. In December 1915, Falkenhayn wrote a memorandum to Kaiser Wilhelm II. This document, which would later become known as the Christmas Memorandum, outlined his thinking with brutal clarity. Britain, he argued, was the real enemy. Britain was the foundation of the Allied war effort. But Britain could not be attacked directly. The British Expeditionary Force held a sector of the Western Front that was well defended and not suitable for offensive operations. And attacking Britain itself was impossible except through submarine warfare. But Britain had a weapon, Falkenhayn reasoned. That weapon was France. The French army, with its 96 divisions, was Britain's sword on the continent. If France could be knocked out of the war, Britain would have no choice but to seek terms with Germany. The question was how to accomplish this. Falkenhayn looked at the problem with the cold logic of an accountant calculating profit and loss. Germany did not have the manpower to defeat France in a single massive breakthrough. The battles of 1915 had proven that. At Champagne, at Artois, massive offensives had gained a few miles at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. No, Falkenhayn thought. A breakthrough was unnecessary. What Germany needed to do was bleed France white, drain the French army of its lifeblood until it simply could not continue fighting. The strategy that emerged one of deliberate attrition. Falkenhayn would select a point on the French line that had both strategic value and tremendous symbolic importance to France, a place that the French would feel compelled to defend at any cost. Then he would attack that place, not necessarily to capture it quickly, but to create a killing ground where French reserves and destroyed by German artillery fire. The place Falkenhayn selected was Verdun. Verdun was perfect for his purposes. The fortress complex threatened German communication lines. It represented a salient, a bulge in the French defensive line that could be attacked from three sides. It was protected by a ring of fortifications, Massive concrete forts built in the decades following France's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. But most importantly, had immense symbolic value to France. It was an ancient city, a place that had resisted German sieges for over 1,000 years. To lose Verdun would be an enormous blow to French national pride and morale. Falkenhayn's plan was methodical and terrifying in its cold precision. German forces would seize the heights on the east bank of the Meuse River with a massive artillery bombardment. This would give them excellent observation points and create a situation where the French would be forced to counterattack to retake these positions. As French reserves poured in, German artillery would destroy them. Limited German infantry attacks would keep the pressure on, but the real killing would be done by the guns. The French army would be ground to pieces, unit by unit, division by division, until France had no choice but to sue for peace. The Germans gave this operation a name. They called it Unternehmensgericht, Operation Judgment. It was an appropriate name. Verdun was to be the place of judgment, where France would be weighed in the balance and found wanting. Through the winter of 1915 to 1916, the Germans prepared for the greatest concentration of artillery firepower the world had ever seen. Over 1,200 guns were assembled in the forests north of Verdun. These ranged from small 77mm field guns to massive 420mm howitzers that fired shells weighing nearly a ton. Special railway lines were built to bring forward the millions of shells that would be needed for the bombardment. 140,000 German infantry from Crown Prince Wilhelm's Fifth Army were positioned for the assault. The elite stormtroopers, armed with flamethrowers and grenades, trained for the assault on the French fortifications. The Crown Prince himself, the 28-year-old son of the Kaiser, was skeptical of Falkenhayn's strategy. He believed that Verdun should be taken quickly and decisively, not turned into a prolonged battle of attrition. But Falkenhayn was adamant. The goal was not to capture Verdun rapidly. The goal was to create a battle that would destroy the French army. The attack was originally scheduled for February 12, 1916, but the weather did not cooperate. Heavy snowstorms and freezing rain made movement impossible and prevented German aerial reconnaissance from identifying French artillery positions. Day after day, the attack was postponed. German soldiers huddled in their assembly trenches, waiting for the order to attack, knowing that when it came, they would be advancing into a storm of fire. On the French side, the warnings were clear, but they went unheeded. French intelligence reported a massive German buildup opposite Verdun. Deserters from the German lines provided detailed information about the coming attack. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the German artillery positions. The French High Command under General Joseph Joffre dismissed these warnings. Joffre was a portly, imperturbable man who believed firmly in the doctrine of the offensive. In his view, the war would be won not by sitting in trenches waiting for the Germans to attack, but by launching massive French offensives that would break through the German line. To that end, he was hoarding French reserves and artillery for a great summer offensive planned for the Somme River Valley in coordination with the British. Verdun, in Joffre's view, was a secondary sector. If the Germans wanted to attack there, let them. It would draw German reserves away from the sectors where France would launch its own offensives. This strategic calculation had fatal consequences for the defenses of Verdun. In the months before the German attack, Joffre's headquarters had actually stripped Verdun of much of its heavy artillery. Guns that should have been defending the fortress were sent to other sectors or held in reserve for the planned Somme offensive. The garrison of Fort Douaumont, the largest and most powerful of Verdun's ring of forts, was reduced from several hundred men to just 57 elderly territorial soldiers. Other forts were similarly stripped of their defenders and guns. The French soldiers holding the line north of Verdun knew something was wrong. They could hear the Germans working at night, bringing up guns and supplies. They could see the observation balloons hanging in the sky behind the German lines. They sent reports up the chain of command, warning that an attack was imminent. But nothing was done. The French High Command was looking elsewhere, planning offensives, not preparing for defense. And so, as February 19th turned to February 20th, and February 20th to February 21st, the soldiers in the French trenches north of Verdun waited. They did not know that in just a few hours, their world would explode. Part 2. The opening bombardment. February 21st, 1916, at exactly 7:15 in the morning on February 21st. A single German gun fired. The shell arsed through the gray winter sky and struck the Cathedral of Verdun, 9 miles behind the French front lines. It was a ranging shot, fired to test the German artillery's accuracy and to signal the beginning of the bombardment. Then at 7:15 exactly, 1,200 German guns opened fire simultaneously. Imagine, if you can, what this sounded like. Imagine the roar of over 1,000 cannons firing at once. The sound was so loud that it could be heard over 100 miles away in the mountains of the Vosges. The shook. Build of Verdun, miles from the bombardment zone, had their windows shattered by the concussion. Civilians huddled in cellars, terrified, as the world outside seemed to be tearing itself apart. For the French soldiers in the forward trenches, it was the end of the world. The German artillery plan was methodical and comprehensive. The bombardment covered a front about 12 miles along the east bank of the Meuse River. But it was not a random pounding. The Germans had carefully plotted every French trench, every strong point, every communication route. They knew where the French command posts were located, where the artillery batteries were positioned, where the reserves were sheltering. And they had allocated specific batteries to destroy each target. The bombardment began with high explosive shells designed to destroy trenches and fortifications. These massive shells, some weighing hundreds of pounds, descended on the French positions in a continuous rain of steel and explosives. When they struck, they created craters 15 feet deep and 30 feet across. Men caught in the open were simply vaporized. Those in trenches were buried alive as the walls collapsed on top of them. Those in dugouts felt the earth shake with each impact, wondering if the next shell would be the one that brought tons of earth crashing down to entomb them. But the high explosive shells were just the beginning. Mixed in with them were shrapnel shells, designed to explode above ground and spray deadly metal fragments over a wide area. These were particularly effective against soldiers trying to move in the open or man defensive positions. Then came gas shells, releasing clouds of chlorine and phosgene that seeped into trenches and dugouts. The French soldiers had gas masks, crude devices that filtered the air through charcoal and cotton, but these were uncomfortable to wear and reduced visibility. Many men removed their masks too soon, gasping for clean air, only to inhale lungfuls of poison gas. Perhaps most terrifying of all were the shells from the massive 400mm howitzers. The French soldiers called these guns Big Berthas, though the name actually referred to a different German weapon. Each shell from these monster guns weighed nearly 2,000 pounds. When they hit, they created explosions that could destroy an entire section of trench. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers heard these shells coming, a distant rumble that grew louder and louder until the shell struck with a blast that felt like the earth itself was splitting open. One French soldier who survived this opening bombardment wrote in his diary, "The shells rained down without stopping. You could not see, you could not hear, you could not think. All you could do was cower in whatever hole you could find. You could pray that the next shell would not land on you." Men went mad. I saw soldiers simply stand up and walk into the open, as if they had decided that death was preferable to enduring one more minute of this hell. For 9 hours, the bombardment continued. 9 hours of continuous artillery fire. 2 millions were fired that first day alone. Think about that number. 2 million shells. Each one had to be manufactured, transported to the front, positioned, loaded, and fired. Each one represented an individual act of attempted murder. And collectively, they transformed the landscape north of Verdun into something that no longer resembled the earth. The French trenches simply disappeared. In their place was a churned wilderness, overlapping shell craters. Trees were shattered into matchsticks. Buildings were reduced to piles of rubble. Even the dead could not rest in peace. Shells dug up corpses from earlier fighting and scattered their remains across the battlefield. Later, when French soldiers advanced over this ground, they would find pieces of uniforms, bits of bone, scraps of flesh hanging from the splintered trees, all that remained of men who had died weeks or months before. At 4:45 in the afternoon, just as the winter light was beginning to fade, the German artillery shifted its fire. Instead of pounding the French front line, The guns now targeted the French rear areas, cutting communication lines, destroying roads, isolating the forward troops from reinforcement or retreat. And then, through the smoke and dust, the German infantry advanced. They came in small groups, moving carefully from crater to crater, stormtroopers in the lead with their flamethrowers and sacks of grenades. These were not the massed human wave attacks that had characterized earlier battles. The Germans had learned that such tactics simply led to slaughter by machine gun fire. Instead, they used infiltration tactics, probing for weak spots, bypassing strong points, getting behind the French defenders, and attacking them from the rear. The French defenders who had survived the bombardment were in shock. Many were wounded, bleeding, half buried in collapsed trenches. Others been deafened by the explosions, or were suffering from gas poisoning. Communication with their commanders had been cut. Many units had lost all their officers. They did not know what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. But they fought. How they fought. With rifles and machine guns, with grenades and bayonets. With rocks and fists when their ammunition ran out, the French soldiers resisted the German advance. In dozens of shattered positions across the bombardment zone, small groups of men held out until they were overrun or killed. One account describes a French machine gun crew that continued firing even after the walls of their position had collapsed around them. They had to dig out the gun after each German artillery barrage, set it up again, and resume firing. They held their position for 2 days before a German flamethrower team finally silenced them. But individual heroism could not stop the methodical German advance. By nightfall on February 21st, the Germans had advanced up to 2 miles in some sectors. They had suffered surprisingly light casualties, exactly as Falkenhayn had planned. The artillery had done its work, destroying French positions and making resistance impossible. The French forward divisions had suffered catastrophic losses. Over 60% of the men in these units were casualties in the first day alone. Entire companies had simply ceased to exist. Battalions were reduced to a few dozen survivors. And this was just the first day. Behind the lines, in Verdun itself, and at French Army headquarters, the news was received with shock and alarm. The Germans were attacking in force at Verdun. The defenses were crumbling. Reinforcements were needed immediately. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, was awakened in the middle of the night with the news. For once, his legendary dirted him. He realized that his decision to strip Verdun of artillery and troops had been a terrible mistake. The Germans were not launching a diversionary attack. This was a full-scale offensive aimed at one of France's most important fortresses, and the French were not prepared to stop it. Part 3. The fall of Fort Douaumont, February 25, 1916. 4 days into the Battle of Verdun, the German advance had continued relentlessly. Despite heroic French resistance, despite counterattacks that temporarily slowed the German momentum, the gray-uniformed German infantry kept coming, always preceded by devastating artillery barrages. Now, the German spearhead approached Fort Douaumont, the crown jewel of Verdun's defensive system. Fort Douaumont was an impressive structure. Built in the 1880s as part of France's reconstruction of its military after the disaster of the Franco-Prussian War, it sat atop the highest point for miles around, dominating the surrounding landscape. Its walls were concrete 7 feet thick, topped with several feet of earth to absorb the impact of artillery shells. It had retractable gun turrets mounting heavy artillery pieces that could cover the approaches to Verdun. It had underground barracks that could house hundreds of soldiers, magazines filled with ammunition, and its own electrical generating system. Under normal circumstances, Fort Douaumont was virtually impregnable. But circumstances were not normal. Thanks to Joffre's decision to strip Verdun of its defenses, Fort Douaumont was by exactly 57 soldiers, not 570. 57. Most of these were elderly territorial troops, reservists who were manning the fort while the regular garrison served elsewhere. They had no artillery ammunition for the fort's big guns. Most of the fort's defensive weapons had been removed. In essence, one of the most powerful fortifications in France had been reduced to little more than a concrete shell. On the morning of February 25th, a small German patrol approached the fort. They were part of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, and they had been ordered to scout the fort's defenses, not to attempt to capture it. The patrol, led by a sergeant named Kunz, crept through the shell-cratered landscape surrounding the fort, expecting at any moment to be cut down by machine gun fire from the fort's embrasures. But no fire came. The fort seemed deserted. Kunz and his men found an entrance that was not only undefended but actually open. They entered cautiously, moving through dark corridors, their rifles ready. Still no opposition. They heard voices and found a group of French soldiers sheltering in one of the underground chambers. The French surrendered without resistance. Kunz and his patrol moved deeper into the fort, rounding up French soldiers as they went. Eventually, they encountered a French officer, Lieutenant Chenot, who was in command of the fort's tiny garrison. Chenot, seeing that his position was hopeless, surrendered the fort. The Germans had captured Fort Douaumont without firing a shot, without suffering a single casualty. The most powerful fortification in the Verdun defensive system had fallen to a patrol of fewer than a dozen men because it had been left essentially undefended. When news of Douaumont's fall reached Germany, there was jubilation. Church bells rang across the country. Schools were given a holiday. The Kaiser sent a telegram of congratulations to Crown Prince Wilhelm. German newspapers proclaimed a great victory. Surely, they said, the fall of Douaumont meant that Verdun's fall was imminent. In France, the news was received very differently. The loss of Douaumont was a blow to French morale that cannot be overstated. This was not just a military setback, it was a national humiliation. How could such a powerful fort fall so easily? French newspapers tried to downplay the disaster, claiming that Douaumont had only been evacuated after a heroic defense. But the soldiers at the front knew the truth, and the French high command knew they had to retake Douaumont at any cost. But first, they had to stop the German advance. And for that, they needed a commander who understood defense, who could stabilize the situation before Verdun itself fell to the German onslaught. The man they chose was Philippe Pétain. Part 4, They Shall Not Pass. Pétain takes command. Philippe Pétain was 59 years old in February 1916, elderly by the standards of most First World War generals. He was a taciturn, cold man, not given to grand gestures or inspiring speeches. But he had one crucial quality that made him perfect for the defense of Verdun. He believed in defense. In an army that worshipped the offensive, that taught its officers that attack was the solution to every problem, Pétain was almost alone in understanding that modern firepower had made frontal assaults suicidal. Pétain had spent the first year and a half of the war watching French offensives fail with terrible losses. He had seen good men thrown away in attacks against German machine guns and barbed wire. He had argued for better defensive preparations, for using artillery more effectively, for caring about the lives of the common soldiers, instead of just demanding that they attack, always attack, regardless of the cost. Now finally, Pétain's moment had come. On February 25th, the same day Fort Douaumont fell, he was given command of the French Second Army, responsible for the defense of Verdun. His orders were simple: hold Verdun at any cost. Pétain arrived at his new headquarters on February 26th and immediately set about organizing the defense. His first concern was artillery. The Germans had overwhelming superiority in guns, and Pétain knew that no defense could succeed without adequate artillery support. He ordered every available gun to be brought forward. French artillery batteries that had been scattered across the Verdun sector were concentrated and coordinated. Pétain personally took control of the artillery, ensuring that it was used effectively and not wasted on pointless bombardments. His second concern was the troops. The French soldiers who had been holding the line for the past 5 days were exhausted, traumatized, and in many cases on the verge of collapse. They had endured continuous bombardment and repeated German attacks with little food, less sleep, and no hope of relief. Pétain immediately ordered a rotation system. Fresh divisions would relieve the battered units in the line. The relieved units would be sent to the rear to rest, refit, and recover before being sent back into the battle. This rotation system, which Pétain called the Noria, the water wheel, would become one of the defining features of the Battle of Verdun. Over the course of the 10-month battle, 70% of the entire French army would serve at Verdun, but for relatively short periods. This meant that the trauma of Verdun was spread across the whole French military, touching almost every regiment, every division. It meant that Verdun was not just a battle fought by a few unfortunate units, but a national experience that marked an entire generation of French soldiers. Peyton's third concern was supply. The German bombardment had destroyed most of the roads leading to Verdun. There was essentially only one route still open, a secondary running from the town of Bar-le-Duc, 30 miles to the southwest, to Verdun itself. This road had to carry everything the army needed: ammunition, food, medical supplies, reinforcements. Pétain realized that if this road was cut or became impassable, Verdun would fall. He assigned an entire engineer regiment to maintain the road, working around the clock to repair shell damage and keep traffic moving. The road became known as the Voie sacrée, the Sacred Way. At its peak, a truck passed a given point on the road every 14 seconds. 35,000 vehicles, everything from military trucks to requisitioned Paris taxicabs, carried 90,000 men and 500,000 tons of supplies to Verdun each week. Senegalese troops from France's African colonies were assigned to maintain the road, spreading gravel and filling shell craters while under German artillery fire. The Voie sacrée became the lifeline of Verdun, and Pétain protected it as fiercely as he protected the fortress itself. Finally, Pétain issued orders to his troops. There would be no more retreats. Every position would be defended to the last man. If the Germans wanted Verdun, they would have to pay for it with German blood. And Pétain reportedly said words that became legendary. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable in the battle's first week, now began to slow. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because they were running into better organized French defenses, backed by increasing amounts of artillery. The Germans had advanced several miles and captured Fort Douaumont, but they had not broken through. They had not reached Verdun. And now every yard they advanced cost them more casualties. Falkenhayn's plan had called for French reserves to be drawn into the battle and destroyed by German artillery. That part was working. French divisions were indeed being thrown into the Verdun sector. But what Falkenhayn had not anticipated was that German divisions were also being consumed by the battle. The German Fifth Army was suffering heavy casualties, not from French counterattacks, but from French artillery fire and from the simple grinding attrition of trying to take and hold ground in the face of determined resistance. By the end of February, barely 10 days into the battle, German casualties were almost equal to French casualties. Falkenhayn's carefully calculated strategy of one-sided attrition was already failing. But the started had taken on a life of its own. Both sides were now committed. Both sides had invested too much blood and prestige to back down. Verdun had become exactly what Crown Prince Wilhelm had feared. Not a quick victory, but a prolonged struggle that neither side could win and neither side could afford to lose. Part 5. The Expansion of Hell. Both banks of the Meuse. Falkenhayn looked at the reports from Verdun with growing concern. His neat strategy of bleeding the French white while conserving German manpower was not working as planned. The battle became a two-sided slaughter. French divisions were being destroyed, yes, but so were German divisions, and the advance had stalled. The Germans held Fort Douaumont and some of the heights north of Verdun, but the city itself remained in French hands, and the French showed no sign of giving up. The problem, Falken realized, was that the German advance was being hit by French artillery fire from the west bank of the Meuse River. The original German attack had been limited to the east bank, as Falkenhayn had wanted to minimize the frontage of the assault and conserve German infantry. But this meant that French guns on the western heights, positions with names like Le Mont and Hill 304, could fire into the flank of any German advance on the eastern bank. Reluctantly, Falkenhayn authorized an expansion of the offensive. German forces would attack on both banks of the Meuse simultaneously. This would double the size of the battle and require the commitment of many more German troops. It was the exact opposite of Falkenhayn's original intention to win through artillery attrition while minimizing infantry losses. But there seemed to be no choice. Without silencing the French guns on the west bank, further advances on the east bank were impossible. The attacks on the west bank began in early March 1916. The targets were two hills with unremarkable names that would become synonymous with some of the worst fighting of the entire war: Le Mont, the Dead Man, and Hill 304. Le Mont was not a particularly high hill. It rose only about 1,000 feet above the surrounding terrain. But from its summit, French artillery observers had a perfect view of the German rear areas on the east bank of the Meuse. As long as the French held Le Morum, German movements on the east bank were visible and vulnerable to French artillery fire. The battle for Le Morum became a nightmare that lasted for months. The Germans attacked again and again, preceded by massive bombardments that turned the hill into a lunar landscape of shell craters. The French defended with equal determination, launching counterattacks to retake any ground lost. Neither side would yield. A French officer described the scene at Le Morum in his diary. The hill no longer exists. It has been blown apart by shells and remade by shells, over and over again. What was once the summit is now a crater field. There are no trenches, only shell holes where men crouch and wait for death. The bodies of the dead are everywhere, French and German mixed together, buried and unburied by successive bombardments. We hold the hill not because we have fortifications, but because we have bodies. We pile up our dead and hide behind them. The fighting was not just about artillery and trenches. It was hand-to-hand combat in the most literal sense. Men fought with bayonets, with entrenching tools, with rocks and bare hands. A French soldier wrote, "I killed a German by smashing his head with a rock. Then I vomited and wept. But an hour later I killed another, and this time I felt nothing. Verdun does this to you. It turns you into something that is no longer quite human." The Germans introduced a new weapon at Le Morum, the flamethrower. These terrifying devices shot streams of burning gasoline that could clear a trench or bunker in seconds. French soldiers caught by flamethrowers died in agony, their screams adding to the cacophony of battle. But the flamethrowers had a limited range, and the men carrying them were priority targets. They often died before getting close enough to use their weapons. By late April, the Germans had captured most of Le Morum, but at a staggering cost. Thousands of German soldiers had been killed or wounded in the fighting, and the French still held part of the hill and continued to shell German positions from what remained of their observation posts. The pattern was the same at Hill 304. Attack, bombardment, counterattackment. Advance a few hundred yards, lose a few hundred yards, advance again. The ground changed hands multiple times, and with each change, more men died. A German soldier wrote home, "We thought Verdun would be over in a few days. Now it has been 2 months, and there is no end in sight. Every day we lose men, not in great battles, but in 2s and 3s, picked off by snipers, buried by shells, killed by gas. Yesterday my best friend was hit by a shell fragment. It took off the top of his skull. I tried to help him, but there was nothing I could do. He died in my arms. How much longer can this go on?" The answer, tragically, was much longer, because while the fighting raged on Le Morum and Hill 304, the battle on the east bank of the Meuse was intensifying. The Germans were launching new attacks aimed at breaking through the French defenses and reaching Verdun itself. Part 6. Fort Vaux and the Summer of Death. As spring turned to summer in 1916, the Battle of Verdun had become the dominant fact of the war on the Western Front. Every day, the newspapers' casualty lists that seemed to stretch forever. Families across France and Germany waited anxiously for news of their sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. And at Verdun itself, the killing continued without pause. On June 1st, the Germans launched a new major offensive on the east bank of the Meuse. The target was Fort Vaux, a smaller fort southeast of the ruined Douaumont. Unlike Douaumont, Fort Vaux was fully manned and ready to fight. Its garrison, under the command of Major Sylvain Genrenal, numbered about 250 men, and they had no intention of surrendering their post. The Germans began with a bombardment that lasted 4 days. Heavy shells pounded the fort, but the thick concrete walls held. Then, noon second, German infantry supported by flamethrowers attacked the fort's superstructure, the above-ground portions that housed machine gun positions and observation posts. The fighting for Fort Vaux became one of the epic struggles of the First World War. The Germans captured the surface positions, but the French garrison retreated into the underground galleries and barracks. There, in the darkness beneath tons of concrete and earth, a brutal battle developed. Germans and French fought in narrow corridors, throwing grenades around corners, firing blindly into the darkness. The air became thick with smoke and gas from explosions. Men suffocated in the confined spaces, or were killed by grenade fragments ricocheting off the concrete walls. Major Raynal organized his men into defensive positions at key junctions in the fort's underground complex. The French had machine guns covering every approach, and ammunition, at least initially, was plentiful. But they had one critical shortage: water. The fort's water supply had been cut early in the bombardment, and the garrison's only water was a small amount in their canteens, and a tiny trickle that condensed from moisture on the walls. As days passed and the fighting continued, the water situation became desperate. Wounded men begged for water. Men who were not wounded developed fever from dehydration. Raynal sent carrier pigeons, the fort's only means of communication with French headquarters, with messages describing the situation. One message read, "We are holding on, but we urgently need water. The men are suffering terribly." The French tried to relieve Fort Vaux with counterattacks from outside, but these were beaten back by German artillery and machine gun fire. The garrison was on its own. Inside the fort, the situation deteriorated hour by hour. The air was foul, thick with the smell of explosives, unwashed bodies, and the beginning of decay from the corpses that could not be buried. Men went mad from the combination of thirst, fear, and the unending explosions that shook the concrete around them. Some tried to drink their own urine. Others licked moisture from the walls. On June 7th, Raynal sent his last carrier pigeon with a message: "We are holding on, but the situation is desperate. This is my last pigeon." The bird, named Valiant, flew through a storm and machine gun fire and reached French lines. For this, the bird was later awarded the Croix de Guerre, France's military decoration for heroism. But no help came. The French simply could not break through the German lines surrounding the fort. Finally, on June 7th, with his men dying of thirst, with ammunition nearly exhausted, with the forts foul that men could barely breathe, Major Raynal surrendered. He emerged from the fort with his surviving. As spring turned to summer in 1916, the Battle of Verdun consumed both armies in a furnace of destruction. Every day brought new casualty lists. Every week, fresh divisions were fed into the mincing machine. And now, the Germans prepared to launch their next major assault on the eastern bank of the Meuse River. The target was Fort Vaux, smaller fortress southeast of the captured Douaumont. Unlike Douaumont, which had vowed a fight due to criminal negligence, Fort Vaux was fully garrisoned and ready to resist. Its commander was Major Sylvain Raynal, 49-year-old career officer who had already been wounded twice in the war. Raynal had approximately 250 men under his command, a mixture of infantry, machine gunners, and engineers. They had ammunition, they had grenades, they had determination. But they had one critical shortage that would doom them: water. The fort's water supply came from a cistern fed by rainwater collected from the fort's roof. But German artillery had destroyed the collection system early in the bombardment. The garrison's only water was what remained in the cistern and what the men carried in their canteens. It was not nearly enough. On June 1st, 1916, the German bombardment of Fort Vaux intensified. For 3 solid days, approximately 8,000 shells per day rained down on the fort. These were not just ordinary artillery shells. The Germans were using their heaviest weapons, including the massive 420mm howitzers that had earned the nickname Big Bertha. Each shell from these monsters weighed nearly a ton. When they hit, the entire fort shook, concrete cracked. Dust filled the air. Men were deafened by the concussions. Inside the fort, Raynal's men waited. They knew an infantry assault was coming. They could do nothing but endure the bombardment and prepare to fight. On June, at dawn, bombardment shifted the approaches around the fort. German stormtroopers, elite assault troops armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and submachine guns, advanced through the smoke and dust. They were led by Lieutenant Kurt Rakow, an experienced assault commander who had studied the fort's defenses carefully. The French soldiers manning the fort's exterior positions fought desperately. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The German flamethrowers were particularly terrifying weapons. They shot streams of burning gasoline that could reach 60 feet. Anyone caught by a flamethrower died in agony, their screams adding to the chaos of battle. The French defenders on the fort's surface were forced to retreat into the underground galleries. And then something unprecedented happened. The Germans followed them inside. The Battle of Fort Vaux became the first major engagement of World War to be fought entirely inside a fortification. The Germans entered through damaged observation posts and through the counterscarp galleries, defensive passages that ran underneath the fort's moat. They advanced in the dark, smoke-filled corridors, and there they met Major Raynal's prepared defenses. Raynal had organized his men brilliantly. At every junction, every turn in the corridors, he had placed barricades made of sandbags, furniture, and debris. Behind these barricades, French machine gunners waited. When the Germans appeared, the machine guns opened fire. In the confined space of the corridors, with nowhere to take cover, the effect was devastating. German soldiers fell in heaps. Their flamethrowers, so effective in the open, were useless in the narrowages. But the Germans kept coming. They threw grenades around corners. They fired into the darkness. They brought up their own machine guns and returned fire. The battle in the corridors became a nightmare of smoke, explosions, screaming men, and bodies piling up on the floor. Neither side could see clearly. The air was thick with smoke from grenades and gunpowder. Men fired at muzzle flashes. Grenades bounced off walls, exploding with ear-shattering force in the confined spaces. Wounded men lay in the corridors, crying for water, for help for their mothers. The fighting went on hour after hour, all through June 2nd and into June 3rd. The Germans advanced a few meters, were driven back, advanced again. The French counterattacked, trying to push the Germans out of the fort entirely, but failed. Slowly, meter by meter, the Germans pushed deeper into the fort. They could not break through Raynal's defensive lines. Above ground, the French army tried desperately to relieve Fort Vaux. Infantry attacks were launched from the south, trying to break through the German lines surrounding the fort. Every attack failed. German artillery and machine guns cut down the French soldiers before they could reach the fort. The approaches to Fort Vaux became carpeted with French bodies. Inside the fort, the situation was deteriorating. The air was becoming foul, thick with the smell of explosives, unwashed bodies, blood, and beginning stages of decay from the bodies that could not be removed. The temperature was rising as more and more men packed into the underground chambers, and worst of all, the water was running out. By June 4th, the garrison's water supply was nearly exhausted. Men who were not wounded were developing fever from dehydration. Wounded men begged for water with cracked lips and swollen tongues. Raynal ordered strict water rationing, but there was simply not enough. Some men had to drink their own urine. Others licked condensation from the walls. Raynal sent messages to French headquarters using carrier pigeons, the only means of communication he had left. The telephone lines had been cut by shell fire days ago. One pigeon after another was released from the fort's small dovecote, flying through German machine gun fire to reach French lines. The messages were desperate. "We are holding on, but we urgently need water. The men are suffering terribly. We need immediate relief." But no relief came. The French simply could not break through. On June 5th, Raynal sent an extraordinary message. He requested that French artillery bomb Fort Vaux from the outside, even though this would kill French soldiers. His reasoning was that if the bombardment could drive the Germans off the top of the fort, some men might be able to escape. French artillery did bombard the fort, but the Germans held on. On June 6th, Raynal released his last carrier pigeon. The bird was named Vaillant, which means valiant in French. Attached to its leg was a message: "We are still holding on. But we are at the limits of our endurance. This is my last pigeon." Vaillant flew through a storm of German gunfire. The bird was hit, but it kept flying. Wounded and exhausted, Vaillant reached French lines and delivered its message before dying. For this act of heroism, the bird was later awarded the Croix de Guerre, France's decoration of military valor. A monument to Vaillant still stands at Fort Vaux today. But there would be no relief. By the morning of June 7th, the garrison had been without water for 3 days. Men were collapsing from dehydration. Some had gone mad, hallucinating, crying out for water that did not exist. Raynal himself was suffering from fever. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His men were dying not from German bullets, but from thirst. At 6 a.m. on June 7, 1916, Major Raynal made the most painful decision of his military career. He ordered his men to destroy their weapons and ammunition so it would not fall into German hands. Then he surrendered Fort Vaux to the Germans. The Germans allowed Raynal to surrender with full military honors. When Crown Prince Wilhelm, commander of the German Fifth Army, learned of Raynal's defense of Fort Vaux. He was so impressed that he presented Raynal with a French officer's sword as a token of respect. This was an almost unprecedented gesture between enemies in wartime. Of the approximately 250 men who had defended Fort Vaux, fewer than 100 walked out when it surrendered. The rest were dead or too wounded to move. Raynal and his surviving men were taken to camps in Germany, where they would remain until the armistice in November 1918. The fall of Fort Vaux was a blow to French morale, but it was also proof of the extraordinary courage of ordinary French soldiers. The garrison had held out for 6 days against overwhelming German superiority, fighting without water in conditions that can barely be imagined. They had not failed. They had simply endured the unendurable until human flesh could endure no more. And the Germans had paid a terrible price for their victory. Hundreds of German soldiers had been killed or wounded in the fighting for Fort Vaux. The fort's underground galleries were choked with German and French bodies. And strategically, the capture of Fort Vaux brought the Germans no closer to taking Verdun itself. Part 7. The last German offensive attack on Fauville with Fort Vaux in German hands. There was only one major obstacle remaining before Verdun itself: Fort Souville. This fort sat on the heights, directly overlooking the city. If the Germans could capture Souville, their artillery observers would be able to see into Verdun's streets. The city would become untenable. France would have to abandon Verdun, or watch its soldiers be slaughtered by German artillery fire. Falkenhayn, watching from his headquarters, believed that one more push, one more massive effort, might break the French will to resist. He authorized what would be the final German offensive at Verdun. On June 23, 1916, the Germans used a new weapon for the first time at Verdun: phosgene gas shells. Phosgene was deadlier than the chlorine gas that had been used earlier in the war. It was colorless, difficult to detect, and it killed by destroying lung tissue. Men who inhaled phosgene often felt fine initially, but hours later their lungs would fill with fluid, and they would drown in their own bodily fluids. Over 100,000 gas shells were fired at French positions around Fort Souville. Thousands of French soldiers were gassed. Some died immediately. Others survived but suffered permanent lung damage that would kill them years later. On July 11th and 12th, the Germans launched their assault. 40,000 German soldiers across a 6-mile front. They were preceded by an artillery bombardment of 330,000 shells. This was German military power at its absolute peak. These were veteran soldiers, battle-hardened by months of fighting at Verdun. They were supported by the best artillery in the world, and they were attacking French defenders who were exhausted, depleted, barely hanging on. The Germans advanced. They captured the village of Fleury devant Douaumont, or what was left of it after months of bombardment. They pushed forward toward Fort Souville. By the afternoon of July 12th, German soldiers had actually reached the roof of Fort Souville. They were standing on top of the fort, so close to victory that they could see the spires of Verdun's cathedral in the distance. This was the high water mark of the German offensive at Verdun, the moment of maximum German penetration. If they could take Fort Souville, Verdun would fall, but they could not take it. The handful of German soldiers who reached the fort's roof were met by a French counterattack. The French had brought up every available reserve. They fired 100,000 artillery shells at the Germans attacking Souville. French machine guns cut down German soldiers by the hundreds. The German attack, which had seemed unstoppable just hours before, broke apart. By the evening of July 12th, the Germans were retreating. They had come within a few hundred meters of victory. They had pushed the French to the absolute breaking point, but they had not broken through. And now they never would. Tide turns. The Somme offensive, the Battle of Verdun, did not end on July 12th. But from that day forward, the initiative belonged to France. The reason was simple. The British had finally joined the battle. On July 1st, 1916, the British launched their great offensive on the Somme River, about 50 miles northwest of Verdun. This was the attack that France and Britain had been planning since the previous year. The Battle of the Somme would become one of the bloodiest battles in human history, with the British suffering 6,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead, on the first day alone. But the Somme offensive accomplished something crucial. it forced Germany to divert resources away from Verdun. German divisions that had been earmarked for Verdun were instead sent north to face the British. German artillery that should have been pounding French positions at Verdun was moved to the Somme. The German army, already stretched thin by the demands of fighting on both the western and eastern fronts, simply could not sustain major offensives in two places simultaneously. Falkenhayn's strategy was in ruins. His plan had been to bleed France white at Verdun while conserving German strength. Instead, Germany had bled almost as badly as France. And now, with the Somme drawing away German resources, Verdun had become a defensive battle for Germany as well. On August 7, 1916, Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed Falkenhayn as chief of the German General Staff. Falkenhayn was sent to command the 9th Army in Transylvania, essentially a demotion. He was replaced by the team of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, the duo who had won spectacular victories on the Eastern Front. Hindenburg and Ludendorff looked at Verdun with fresh eyes and came to a harsh conclusion. The offensive had failed. It was time to go on the defensive and hold what had been gained while minimizing further casualties. Part 9. The French counter-offensive, October to December 1916. While the Germans went on the defensive, the French prepared for revenge. General Robert Nivelle had replaced Pétain as commander of the French forces at Verdun. Where Pétain had been defensive-minded and cautious, Nivelle was aggressive and confident. He believed that Verdun could not just be held, but that the ground lost to the Germans could be retaken. Nivelle's plan was bold. He would use the same tactics the Germans had pioneered at the beginning of the battle. A massive artillery bombardment, followed by infantry assault using infiltration tactics. But the French had one advantage the Germans had lacked. They knew the terrain intimately. They had built the forts, dug the trenches, mapped every meter of ground. Now they would use that knowledge to retake what had been lost. Under Nivelle's command was General Charles Mangin, a colonial officer who had made his reputation leading African troops in France's colonial wars. Mangin was fearless, aggressive, and utterly ruthless. His men called him the Butcher because of his willingness to accept heavy casualties to achieve his objectives. But he was also a brilliant tactician who understood how to use artillery and infantry in combination. On October 21, 1916, the French artillery began its bombardment. For 3 days, French guns pounded German positions around Fort Douaumont. The bombardment was carefully planned and executed. The French were using new tactics, including the creeping barrage, where artillery fire moved forward in timed increments, with infantry advancing just behind the curtain of explosions. On October 24th, French infantry attacked. 3 divisions advanced behind the creeping barrage toward Fort Douaumont. The German defenders, many of them recent arrivals, who had not experienced the intensity of fighting at Verdun, were overwhelmed. By the evening of October 24th, Fort Douaumont was back in French hands. 6,000 German soldiers surrendered. A French staff officer who participated in the attack wrote, "Douaumont is ours." The formidable Douaumont, which dominates with its mass and observation points both shores of the Meuse, is again French. 8 days later, on November 2nd, French intelligence intercepted a German radio message. Fort Vaux had been evacuated. The Germans, seeing that Fort Douaumont had fallen and fearing that they would be cut off, had abandoned Fort Vaux during the night. French soldiers entered the fort on November 3rd and found it empty except for German dead who had not been buried and the destruction left by months of occupation. The retaking of Forts Douaumont and Vaux was celebrated across France. Church bells rang. Newspapers proclaimed victory. After 9 months of suffering, after hundreds of thousands of casualties, France had reclaimed the symbols of its resistance. But Nivelle was not finished. He planned one more offensive to push the Germans back even further and secure the heights around Verdun. On December 15, 1916, in temperatures of -20°C, French soldiers launched final attack of the Battle of Verdun. They were attacking in the dead of winter, in snow and ice, against German positions that had been fortified for months. It seemed like madness. But the attack succeeded. Using 886 artillery pieces and 4 divisions of infantry, the French did across a broad front. They recaptured the villages of Louvemont and Bezonvaux, or rather, They recaptured the ground where those villages had once stood before being obliterated by shell fire. They pushed forward to Chambret Farm, extending French control over the heights north of Verdun. On December 18, 1916, the offensive ended. The Battle of Verdun was over. Part 10. The aftermath and legacy. The statistics of the Battle of Verdun are almost incomprehensible in their scale of horror. The battle lasted 303 days. That's 10 months of continuous combat. Every single day, men were dying at Verdun. Total casualties for both sides were approximately 700,000 men. Of these, roughly 300,000 were killed. 163,000 French soldiers died. 143,000 German soldiers died. The wounded numbered 400,000, many of them crippled for life. Think about those numbers for a moment. 700,000 casualties. That's more than the entire population of many cities. That's an entire generation of young men from both nations killed or maimed fighting over a few square miles of ground. And for what? When the battle ended, the front lines were almost exactly where they had been when it started. The Germans had advanced a few miles in some sectors. The French had held Verdun. Neither side had achieved a decisive victory. The Battle of Verdun was, in the most literal sense, pointless, but the cost went beyond the casualty figures. The landscape around Verdun was utterly destroyed. 9 villages that had existeries were completely erased. Beaumont, Vaux, Cumières, Douaumont, Fleury, Haumont, Louvemont, Ornes, and Vaux de Vendôme no longer existed. After the war, these villages were declared to have died for France. They are still administered by mayors, even though no one lives there. They exist only as names on maps and memorials. The land itself was poisoned. An area of approximately 65 square miles was declared a red zone where no development was permitted because of unexploded ordnance. Even today, over a century later, in the area regularly plow up unexploded shells, grenades, and bombs. People still die from World War I ordnance in the Verdun region. The bodies of the dead were often impossible to identify or even recover. The Douaumont ossuary, completed in 1932, contains the remains of approximately 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers. Their bones lie mixed together beneath the monument, former enemies now united in death. For France became a sacred symbol of national resistance. The phrase "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became a rallying cry for the French nation. Verdun represented France's determination never to surrender, never to yield, no matter the cost. Every French soldier who served at Verdun carried that badge for the rest of his life. But Verdun also traumatized an entire generation of French soldiers. 70% of the French army served at Verdun at some point during 1916. They experienced things that broke men's minds and souls. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was epidemic among Verdun veterans. Many came home changed, unable to readjust to civilian life, haunted by what they had seen and done. For Germany, Verdun was a strategic disaster. Falkenhayn's plan to bleed France white while conserving German strength had failed completely. German casualties were nearly as high as French casualties. The Battle of Verdun, combined with the Battle of the Somme, stretched German military resources to the breaking point. Germany would never fully recover from the losses suffered in 1916. The Battle of Verdun also demonstrated the futility of World War I's tactics and strategy. Despite all the artillery, all the gas, all the new weapons and techniques, neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Defensive firepower had become so overwhelming that offensive operations were suicidal. Yet both sides continued to launch offensives, continued to feed men into the mincing machine, continued to believe that one more push, one more sacrifice, would bring victory. Verdun became the symbol of World War I's senseless slaughter. When people today think of the First World War, they often think of Verdun. The endless shelling, the mud, the bodies, the destruction, the pointless sacrifice of a generation. Epilogue. Voices from Verdun. Let me end this story with the words of those who were there. These are the voices of men who experienced Verdun and tried to describe what they saw. A French soldier wrote, "Verdun is not a battle. It is a place where men's souls are slowly ground to powder. Every day you wake up wondering if this will be the day you die. Every night you go to sleep, knowing they've survived one more day in hell. And the shells keep falling, always falling, until you think you'll go mad from the noise. A German officer recorded in his diary, "We thought Verdun would fall in days. Now it has been months. How many of my men have died? I've lost count. We advance 100 meters and lose 50 men. We hold a position for a day and lose 30 men to artillery fire. What is the point? What are we fighting for? I no longer know." A French medical officer described the wounded. "They come in a never-ending stream. Men with limbs blown off. Men blinded by gas. Men whose minds have broken from the strain. We do what we can, but there are too many, always too many. And when we send them to the rear, new men arrive to take their place in the line. The machine feeds on human flesh, and it is never satisfied." And perhaps most haunting of all, a simple inscription carved into the wall of Fort Vaux by an unknown French soldier, "On ne passe pas," they do not pass. 3 words that sum up the determination, the suffering, and the terrible cost of the Battle of Verdun. Verdun stands as a memorial to the worst that human beings can do to each other in the name of nation and duty. It reminds us that war is not glory and honor, but suffering and death. It teaches us that some victories are not worth their cost, and it challenges us to remember those 700,000 casualties not as statistics, but as individuals. Young men with names, families, hopes, and dreams. Men who went to Verdun and never came home. Men who survived Verdun but were never whole again. Men who gave everything for a few square miles of devastated earth. This is the legacy of Verdun. This is why we must remember. This is why the story must be told. They shall not pass. And they did not. But the price of that defiance was almost more than any nation should be asked to pay.